So I want to talk about the Insurrection Act here, because a lot of people are very worried that Donald Trump is going to invoke the Insurrection Act and declare martial law. As I'm recording this now, it is Saturday, April 19th, and there is a lot of speculation out there that Trump is going to do this tomorrow, invoke the Insurrection Act and declare martial law. And there's a lot of reasons, symbolic importance of April 20th for a few different reasons. Also because Donald Trump has ordered that a report be prepared for him and issued to him by tomorrow. And for these reasons and others, people are really worried that he's gonna impose martial law tomorrow. And not without good reason should people be, generally speaking, worried about the Insurrection Act, because after all, Donald Trump is a criminal. He is a very sick and demented person. He is power hungry. He wants to be a dictator. There's really no doubt about that, and he is taking a lot of affirmative steps to achieving that. There is no way that a president can become a dictator in this country unless people roll over and let it happen, because there are so many layers of protection, checks in our system to prevent that kind of thing from happening. But one after another, one person after another in position of authority, one institution after another, Congress and other institutions throughout our society have caved, and they're making it much easier for Trump to become a dictator than should otherwise be the case. He could be stopped in his tracks. He could be stopped, right now. He could be impeached and removed from office. But we know that's not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. Anyway, so people are rightly worried about what Trump might do. Now, with respect to the Insurrection Act, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. Although what it is very bad. It's a horrendous law because of what it authorizes and for the vagueness with which the statute is written. It is not a tightly crafted statute which clearly delineates what a president can or cannot do under this statute. It is really wide open, which is part of the problem with it. Anyway, instead of reading this statute to you, because it's hard to follow statutory language, there is a good write-up of what the Insurrection Act is and is not, done by the Brennan Center. I will link to it in the description below. But I'm going to read a part of what they have written because it's a good summary, and I'm going to discuss it as we go. So they have this section here. What is the Insurrection Act? So let's begin with that, right? The Insurrection Act authorizes the president to deploy military forces inside the United States to suppress rebellion or domestic violence, or to enforce the law in certain situations. The statute implements Congress's authority under the Constitution to, quote, provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, unquote. It is the primary exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, under which federal military forces are generally barred from participating in civilian law enforcement activities. Although it is often referred to as the Insurrection Act, blah, 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 I don't need to get into that. So what does invoking the Insurrection Act allow the president and the military to do? This really gets to the heart of it. Under normal circumstances, the Posse Comitatus Act forbids the U.S. military, including federal armed forces and National Guard troops who have been called into federal service, from taking part in civilian law enforcement. This prohibition reflects an American tradition that views military interference in civilian government as being inherently dangerous to liberty. Invoking the Insurrection Act temporarily suspends the posse comitatus rule and allows the president to deploy the military to assist civilian authorities with law enforcement. That might involve soldiers doing anything from enforcing a federal court order to suppressing an uprising against the government. Of course, not every domestic use of the military involves law enforcement activity. Other laws, such as the Stafford Act, allow the military to be used to respond to natural disasters, public health crisis, and other similar events without waiving the restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act. In theory, the Insurrection Act should be used only in a crisis that is truly beyond the capacity of civilian authorities to manage. However, the Insurrection Act fails to adequately define or limit when it may be used, and instead gives the president significant power to decide when and where to deploy U.S. military forces domestically. And this goes to the problem with what I referred to as the vagueness of the statute. And this is a problem that's biting us in the ass right now with respect to a lot of statutes. Congress, throughout our history, has done a real shit job of drafting legislation. Lots of times, because with specificity comes specific objections. So if you make it too specific, you lose votes, right? So people drafting this legislation keep it intentionally vague to get as many votes as possible to pass the thing, and then just leave it to the president to decide how to implement it. Well, that's a problem, generally speaking, even under good circumstances. But when you have a president who is as lawless as the one we currently have, that problem really comes into focus, doesn't it? Good example of this is the statute Trump is invoking to impose these massive tariffs. You know, tariffs can only be imposed by Congress, but Congress has written statutes which give the president authority, arguably, to impose these tariffs without any further action of Congress. And Congress has done this in many other ways. They just pass a general law with no specifics, and then authorize the president to basically implement that however you want. That's not what you want to do. And now all of that, decades of Congress doing that, has set up a situation where Donald Trump can exercise all kinds of power that he shouldn't rightfully be able to exercise. And of course, a lot of the powers that he is exercising is flatly unconstitutional, but some of it is arguably legal given the vagueness with which Congress has drafted so many laws. Anyways, let me continue with this here. When can the president invoke the Insurrection Act? Troops can be deployed under 3 sections of the Insurrection Act. Each of these sections is designed for a different set of situations. Unfortunately, the law's requirements are poorly explained and leave virtually everything up to the discretion of the president. Section 251 allows the president to deploy troops if a state's legislature, or governor if the legislature is unavailable, requests federal aid to suppress an insurrection in that state. This provision is the oldest part of the law and the one that has most often been invoked. While Section 251 requires state consent, Sections 252 and 253 allow the president to deploy troops without a request from the affected state, even against the state's wishes. Let me stop there. So the first part that has been invoked several times in the past, it is invoked at the request of a state. If something is beyond the state's ability to control and they need federal assistance, they can request it from the government, from the federal government, and it can be invoked, and therefore you can use the military for domestic law enforcement. The most recent episode in which that was revoked was to help put down the riots following the Rodney King riots, the acquittal of those officers who had beaten Rodney King, and it set off a bunch of riots there in California. And California requested assistance from the federal government, which George H.W. Bush then invoked the Insurrection Act to provide assistance. But Section 252 and 253 allow the president to invoke the Insurrection Act without a request from the state, even if the state is specifically opposed to the federal government getting involved. And so that's the problem. That's where we're at here. Anyways, let me continue here. While Section 251 requires state consent, 252 and 253 allow the president to deploy troops without a request from the affected state, even against the state's wishes. Section 252 permits deployment in order to, quote, enforce the laws of the United States or to suppress rebellion whenever unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion make it impracticable to enforce federal law in that state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. So, if the states and federal law enforcement or regular law enforcement is proving inadequate to enforce the laws of the United States, which means federal law, not state law, federal law. If federal law is not being adequately enforced by regular law enforcement, then the president can call forth the military for the purposes of enforcing federal law. 253, that's under Section 252. Section 253 has two parts. The first allows the president to use the military in a state to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that so hinders the execution of the laws that any portion of the state's inhabitants are deprived of a constitutional right, and state authorities are unable or unwilling to protect that right. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy relied on this provision to deploy troops to desegregate schools in the South after the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education. The second part of Section 253 permits the president to deploy troops to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy in a state that opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. This provision is so bafflingly broad that it cannot possibly mean what it says, or else it authorizes, getting tongue-tied here, or else it authorizes the president to use the military against any two people conspiring to break federal law. Yeah, this statute is very, very poorly drafted. So who decides when the conditions for deployment have been met? Well, nothing in the text of the Insurrection Act defines insurrection, rebellion, domestic violence, or any of the other key terms used in setting forth the prerequisites for deployment. Absent statutory guidance, the Supreme Court decided early on that this question is for the president alone to decide. In an 1828 case, Martin v. Mott, the court ruled that the authority to decide whether an exigency requiring the militia to be called out has arisen belongs exclusively to the president, and his decision is conclusive upon all other persons. So basically, it's completely up to the president, although there have been subsequent decisions that say there's some room for the court to get involved, but generally speaking, it's all up to the president. You can see how dangerous this is. So basically, in a nutshell, because people think this gives the president the power just to declare martial law. Well, it does not do that, although it doesn't mean he won't try it. I mean, the laws in the Constitution don't permit this man to do a lot of the things that he's doing. But I think we need to understand what the Insurrection Act allows him to do and what it doesn't allow him to do. Basically, the purpose of it is when federal law is being violated, or constitutional rights are being denied, or there is a rebellion or insurrection against the United States taking place within the states, any of those things, and the states are unwilling or unable to deal with that issue, or if regular law enforcement at the federal or state level are unable to deal with that issue, then the president, with the state's consent or without, can use the military to enforce those federal laws that are being violated, or to put down the rebellion, or to ensure the constitutional rights of people in those states that are being deprived. That's what it's supposed to do, which in essence you would think is a good thing. If there's a rebellion or an insurrection, okay, maybe it's a good thing to use the military for that if regular law enforcement is not able. Or if the laws of the United States, federal laws, are being violated and federal law enforcement is not able to adequately deal with it, yeah, maybe it's good to use the military there for that limited purpose. Or if people are being denied their constitutional rights because of the states won't do anything about it, or they're inadequate to the task, then maybe, yeah, it would be good to use the military, as Eisenhower and Kennedy did, to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. So yeah, maybe those things are good. But the fact that the language is so overbroad, and there's really no limiting language on the president, and all of it, whether to invoke it and how to invoke it, is up to the discretion of the president, that's a very big problem. And while the president is only authorized by this statute to use it for those purposes, who's to say that once he has deployed the military for use in civilian law enforcement, who's to say he can't then expand that beyond the scope of the Insurrection Act for illegal purposes? Who would put it past Donald Trump to do that? The point is, maybe the purposes here are good, but the language is overbroad, gives the president way too much discretion. But it does not authorize martial law. Again, doesn't mean Donald Trump won't far exceed even the scope of the broad language of the Insurrection Act to try to do these kinds of things, impose martial law, or otherwise violate the Constitution and people's rights. But the Insurrection Act itself does not authorize martial law. Okay, but I guess we need to define terms, because martial law is something that gets thrown around a lot out there, and unless we define what that means, people could take that to mean different things. What martial law means, and I don't think people use it and don't use it correctly a lot of times. What it means is to replace civilian authority with military authority. That's what it means. So you'd basically replace civilian government with military rule. So if you were going to impose it on a state or a city, you can in theory impose it on a town or a city or a county or a state or the entire country. You would replace the civilian government. You'd replace the mayor. You'd replace the city council. You would replace the governor and the state legislature and all that kind of stuff. You'd replace the police. You'd replace civilian government with the military. The military would come in there and they would occupy your state capital or your governor's mansion or the mayor's office, and they would dictate. They would now be the rule of law. Any law that preceded the laws on the books no longer matter. We are now governed by rule of the military. And therefore the president, since the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, there's nothing in the Insurrection Act that authorizes that. There's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes that. So if that is what we mean by martial law, it's what I mean by martial law, because that's what martial law means. People use it to mean other things, but that's what it means. And that is not legal in any way. Invoking the Insurrection Act, it's just completely illegal, unconstitutional from top to bottom, and cannot be legal. Donald Trump can declare a war. I hear this all the time. Oh, he'll invoke the Insurrection Act, or he'll declare we're at war and he'll impose martial law that way. So first of all, the president has no authority to declare war. Only Congress can declare war. But however he gets this war time authority, that does not, he is not specially empowered just because we're at war to impose martial law. Okay, we've had many wars in this country. We've never had martial law. And people think, oh yes, we've had martial law. No, we have never had martial law anywhere in this country. We've had the Insurrection Act invoked. We've had law enforcement conducted by military in the past. That is not martial law. Martial law is replacing civilian government with military rule. We've not had that, and there's nothing that makes that legal. So I just want to be clear about what that is. And by the way, look, if Trump wanted to try to do that, first of all, under any circumstance, that would be illegal and unconstitutional, and there is nothing that makes it. There's nothing that he can do or that Congress can do to make that legal or constitutional, or the Supreme Court. There's just nothing. But if he were to do it, sure, I guess he could take over a town or a city. Maybe he could take over a state, maybe some states, particularly small states. But to impose martial law on this entire country is a tactical impossibility. It is laughably absurd to think that could even possibly happen. This is an enormous country, huge landmass, 50 sovereign states with their own governments, over 330 million people, the most heavily armed population on the face of the earth. And it is just simply impossible. We don't even have anywhere close to the number of people in our military that would be required to impose martial law everywhere in this country. It's just not possible. So that is absurd on its face. But the idea that Donald Trump would use the military against the American people, that's not at all absurd. In fact, I think I would not be surprised if he does it. In fact, I am expecting him, given the right set of circumstances, to do exactly that. He wanted to do it in his first term. We know this for a fact. He wanted to use the military against protesters in Washington, D.C. And in other places. He wanted to use it in the summer of 2020, when there were demonstrations across the country. He wanted to use it. So I have no doubt that he wants to use it and probably will. What that will look like, I don't know. But you know what? At this point, the more flagrantly he wants to violate the Constitution, I mean, I don't want to see this happen. I don't want us to be in the situation we're in. But I am almost at the point, really I am at the point where I say, bring it on. Because we need something to shake up the American people, to finally wake up and remove this man from office. We are headed to fascist dictatorship. That's where we're headed right now. And if something doesn't shock the American people such that they are scared and rise up and demand this man's removal, then he could be successful in destroying our Constitution, becoming a dictator, and never leaving office. Now, I've been talking recently about signs of optimism and hope that he's not going to be successful, and I ultimately don't think he will be. People are beginning to wake up. Groups that you would not expect to oppose him are beginning to oppose him. There's lots of reasons to think that this is not going to end well for Donald Trump, and in the end, I don't think it will end well for him. And I especially think it won't end well for him if he tries any of this crap. If he tries to impose martial law, it's not going to go as he thinks it's going to go. So, yeah, I don't want to see it happen. There certainly is an aspect to be careful what you wish for here. I understand that. But if it takes this psycho attempting to impose martial law to wake people up, rise up and remove him from office, and then send this man to prison for the rest of his life where he belongs, then let's get to it. I don't say that flippantly. I say that seriously. None of this is legal. None of this is constitutional. It's never happened before. This is a horribly unpopular president. People are waking up and opposing him more and more each day. So if that's the direction he wants to go, I think that's only going to help us in removing this man. My goal for this man is to remove him from office. I don't want this man to serve out his full term, let alone staying in office after that. And I don't think it's a pipe dream or fantasy to think that he can and will be removed from office. I think it will happen, or it certainly can, at least. It can happen. And my goal, what I want to see happen, because it is possible, I wouldn't come here and talk about things if they were impossible. I want to see him impeached, removed, and tried for his crimes and sentenced to prison for the rest of his life. That's what should happen. We should demand justice in this country. And if that is justice, that is what he deserves. He's not even qualified under our Constitution to be president per Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Okay, he's a criminal who deserves to be impeached and removed from office and to be convicted for his crimes and spend the rest of his life in prison. That is what justice for this man looks like. Have we all given up on justice in this country? I sure as hell haven't. And that's what justice looks like. Nothing less would be justice. Maybe you think it can't happen. Well, let me tell you something for sure. If enough people have the attitude that it can't happen, it won't happen. And I see far too many people with a defeatist attitude, and what it's going to be in the end is it's going to be essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you convince yourself that we can't do anything to hold this man accountable, then we never will. It's all about attitude at this point, I really believe. My attitude is, let's impeach and remove this son of a bitch and serve upon him the justice he deserves. That means removal from office, indictment, trial, conviction for his crimes, and a life sentence. That's what justice looks like for him. Anyway, I will link in the description below what I read here from the Brennan Center about the Insurrection Act. So there's much more to it, and it's really a good and easy read, so I highly encourage you to check that out. So I'll link that in the description. Also, if you want to become a member of this channel, that is now available to you. So if that's something you're interested in, please check it out. There's special perks to membership also if you're interested in any of that. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Be well, and I'll talk to you again soon.